Aloha, everybody. This is Dan Chun, president and co-founder of Hawaiian Islands Ministries, known as HIM for short. So welcome and aloha to the HIM podcast, where we feature interviews every week, or we intersperse them with talks from the past from our HIM vault, featuring some of our favorite memories from the past. Today is one of those days from the HIM vault. John Ortberg, very popular author, and he's former pastor of Menlo Church in Menlo Park, California, and Willow Creek Community Church. And he has a book coming out in February called Steps, which is really good. In fact, that new book coming out, John Mark Comer said it's one of the best books he's ever read. And I would agree, it's one of the best I've ever read. So here is John Ortberg speaking from a HIM conference, I think back in 23. And take a listen to this very important message from John Ortberg.
You have thousands of believers from hundreds of churches, people that normally wouldn't gather, coming under one name.
The transparency, the vulnerability, the connection that takes place, it's just life-changing.
So affirming and building and just an incredible experience.
This is one of those times where God spoke to me so clearly in my calling to be a pastor. Thanks, HIM Conference.
It's made me realize how much I love him and how impactful he can be to them as well. It just makes me want to be louder for God.
Dan, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be with everybody here in this room, everybody that's joining with us online. This is a great time to be in ministry. It's a remarkably privileged time to be in ministry, and I want to talk for a few moments about why that is. There's an author, Lisa TerKeurst, who notes that very often we have a sense of what we ought to do, who we could become, the ministry that we'd like to build, but we get stopped by a single two-word phrase, but I should work out and get in shape, but I'm tired. I'd love to live relaxed and confident, but I worry too much. It'd be great to support IJM or Compassion International, but I need all the money I got. I should memorize more scripture, but I'm just not good at memorizing. I should spend more time in solitude, but I like being around people too much. I should get in a small group, but I don't like being around people that much. I'd like to serve God better, but I can't preach like him. I can't lead like her. I don't have the mentors, connections, educations, gifts. I don't look good in skinny jeans and will get mocked, but I look too good in skinny jeans and would get criticized. But I'm the wrong age. Everybody thinks they're the wrong age. If you're young, you think people won't trust you. If you're old, you think people won't listen to you. If you don't know whether you're young or old, you're old. I'd like to have a riveting social media, digital discipleship, but I'm too Presbyterian. But I'm discouraged because of COVID, racial unrest, political divisions, mask fights, woke fights, human sexuality fights, decreased attendance, increased inflation, war in the Ukraine, dysfunction in my family, betrayal on my staff, resistance from my elders, criticism from the congregation, suspicion from the community. Anybody here ever say, but I? I'd love to. And it's not just that it keeps me from succeeding in what really matters, it'll stop me from even trying. I'll never even know if I could have done it. And to make things worse, sometimes I find out I'm not even competent in areas where I thought I was competent. When I moved out to the Bay Area, a friend of mine with the San Francisco Giants at that time asked me if I would like to speak for a chapel. And I said, yeah. And he said, would you like to take batting practice? And I thought, well, that'd be really cool. There's a guy, John Yandel, also went to the church. He threw batting practice for Barry Bonds. And he said he would throw me some pitches. John was a couple years older than me. This is not like facing real major league pitching. I played just sandlot neighborhood stuff growing up. I thought I can do this. So I stood in the batter's box at AT&T Park. Amazing moment. And John wound up and let go, and I heard the sound of a ball hitting the net behind me. And I thought, he's not just lobbing them in there. He wants to make this a contest. He's throwing as hard as he can. He wants to see if I can hit his best stuff. So he wound up again. This time I swung, but the ball had already been in the net several seconds by the time my bat got around to the plate. So I kept starting my swing earlier. Eventually, I would begin my swing about the same time that he started his windup. I got several foul balls, and I was feeling pretty good. And then he said, "Do you want me to put a little zip on one?" In other words, those had been his lobs. And I said, "Sure, it's been hard to time these slow pitches." And he wound up, and I never saw it. And I asked him, "Was that your best pitch?" And he said, "No, you wouldn't want to see my best pitch. Good high school player would crunch it, though." It's a true story. He sent a scouting report to Ned Coletti, my friend who was with the Giants at the time. John Ortberg bats right, throws right, took 10 minutes of batting practice. As a hitter, John makes a good pastor. But I stink at baseball, and I don't even know. I'm never doing that again. That little phrase, but I, comes up over and over again, not just in your life and in my life, but in the Bible as an excuse anytime God calls somebody. You know, that word calling is one we tend to romanticize quite heavily. But in the Bible, there's not really anybody who ever gets a calling that they want. Nobody gets called by God and says, "Yeah, I'd like to do that. That sounds great." God says, "Moses, go to Pharaoh, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue." Exodus 4:10, all this is in Scripture. Gideon, "Deliver my people from the Midianites." Judges 6, "But I am the least in my family." Jeremiah, "Be a prophet for me, but I do not know how to speak. I am only a child." Esther, "Go to the king to save my people, but I have not been called by the king for 30 days. Abraham, "Become the father of a great people, but I'm too old." Peter, "Cast your nets on the other side, but I tried all night." Over and over and over and over and over in the Bible, we see these words that are very familiar to you and me. But I. And it's interesting to me, God never disagrees with these statements. He never says, "Hey, Moses, you're a pretty good speaker. Really, Abraham, you're not all that old." Humanly, we often respond that way. We will engage in the colluded denial of inadequacy. No, you're amazing. Interestingly, this was actually a bit of a rhetorical technique in the ancient world. The Apostle Paul, running a church in Corinth, and they're facing huge problems. And there was actually ancient advice from folks like Plutarch about how speakers or writers could get in good with their audience. Be sure to throw in some praise for them. Tell them how intelligent they are, or how connected they are, or how well-born they were. Now, with that as a backdrop, imagine how the Corinthians felt when they read Paul's description of them at the beginning of his letters. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 1. "Brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many of noble birth." Paul does not start out the way that we would. "Hey, Corinth, you got IQ, you got EQ, you got connections, you got resources. How lucky God was to have you sign up. You're killing it." He actually invites them to reflect on their inadequacy. Wise? Nope. Influential? Nope. Great gene pool? Nope. Don't try this at your church, but this is what Paul did for Corinth. And Paul is remarkably untroubled by this. He doesn't say, therefore, lower your expectations. He doesn't say, thank God a few of you are rich and smart. You're the ones God is counting on. Not at all. He says, expect great things because God is up to something that nobody could have expected. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. Now we're starting to get to why this is a great time to be in ministry. But God chose the weak things in the world to shame the strong. But God chose the lowly things of the world and the despised things, the things that are not, to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him. It is because of him that you are in Christ Jesus, who has become for us wisdom from God. That is our righteousness, our holiness, our redemption. Therefore, as it is written, let the one who boasts boast in the Lord. These are the two words that are the turning point of this whole passage, this whole book. But God. But God is now doing in Corinth what he has already done on the cross with Jesus, overturning expectations, elevating the lowly, changing death into life, taking what the world regards as abject, humiliating failure and making it glorious, unstoppable victory. But God means that this world does not get the last word on who you can be or what your church can do. The theme of this conference is everlasting, but I is temporal weakness, but God is everlasting strength. Listen, the world may say your situation will never change. The world may say that your lack of education will always embarrass you, that addiction will always enslave you, that depression will always defeat you, that failure will always define you, that past will always haunt you, that future will always frighten you, that weakness will always stop you. But God says otherwise. But God begs to differ. And by the way, this phrase also gets used dozens of times in the Bible. Joseph said to his brothers who sold him into slavery, you intended it to harm me, but God intended it for good. That's a fabulous phrase for an awful lot of us. The psalmist said, Psalm 73, my flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. You might want to do just a study of that little phrase, but God, in the Bible. The great preacher, scholar, Earl Palmer, said those two words, but God, summarize the whole message of Scripture, the heart of the gospel. Earl said, we disobeyed, but God. We sinned, but God. We rebelled, but God. We wandered away, but God. The preacher James Montgomery Boyce said, if you understand these two words, but God, they will save your soul. If you recall them daily and live by them, they will transform your life completely. But God means that a divine beachhead has been established in a manger in Nazareth in this sorry, dark world. And it may not look like much, but human rulers from Pharaoh to Pilate to Herod, to Caesar, to Vladimir Putin, underestimated to their peril, for they too will die and face judgment, but his kingdom is still growing. Now you ask, how may this be? The preacher Jesus said, with human beings it is impossible, but with God all things are possible. So stop excusing yourself from God's calling on your life by whining about your inadequacy and our difficult times. But I. I know this sounds odd. I just don't know how else to say it. God is bigger than your butt. One T. God is bigger than your church's butt. Of course you're not smart enough. Of course you're not strong enough. Of course you're not good enough. Older I get, the clearer that is to me. But God has chosen the foolish and the weak and the lowly and the meek and the timid and the too loud and the not very polished and those who were in prison and those who were enslaved and whatever is going on in your heart or your ministry or your family or your budget or with your children or with your health, and it looks really bad now, and I know, but God. I tell you, sin, death, pain, and hell are real, but they are not final, because the power of the cross has not yet finished remaking this sorry, dark world. We think these days are hard. We think ministry is difficult. Well, let's listen again for a moment. to our brother Paul and think, now this is a real person who actually lived. This is 2 Corinthians chapter 11. I have been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, been exposed to death and death. Now, in Paul's day, you might know this if you're reading his correspondence at Corinth, there were people, kind of rock star motivational speakers called sophists, and they went around traveling and they mastered the art of rhetoric, and they filled stadia, they commanded big salaries, and they were amongst those most likely that Paul talks about as the super apostles that everybody wants to be around. Paul is going to contrast himself with them. And we would think he would do it by burnishing his credentials. Number of sermons preached, number of souls saved, number of churches planted. Instead, he lists his failures, problems, rejections, and anxieties. It is a celebration of personal inadequacy, climaxing in this. In order to keep me from being conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger from Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. This is 2 Corinthians 12, verses 7 and 8. Apparently, Paul has a problem being conceited. And he's quite open about this with the church. Apparently, it's fairly public knowledge in order to keep me from becoming conceited. It is so bad that he was given some painful and shameful condition he calls a thorn in the flesh. There have been forests of trees cut down to provide the paper for books written about what that thorn might have been. Nobody knows. Might have been a vision problem, might have been epilepsy, maybe a version of PTSD. Maybe Paul suffered from anxiety. He talks about, is anybody in the church anxious? And I'm not anxious. People say he's not eloquent. Maybe he had a speech defect. People say he's not impressive in person. Maybe he's got a weight problem. Whatever it is, it's a source of ridicule and humiliation. And if that's not bad enough, his prayers for thorn removal are a failure multiple times. Paul is a train wreck, a beaten, whipped, tent-making, conceit-prone, thorn-carrying, prayer-failing, self-confessed weakling. And Paul, you're going to lead with that? Those are your credentials? Who in the world would follow somebody like that? Why in the world would anybody talk that way? One reason, 2 words. But God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly, are you kidding me, about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight. Somebody wrote these words, guys. Somebody lived this life. I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulty. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Paul, you cannot be serious. But he is. Everybody's got a calling. Everybody's got a thorn. The question is whether you're going to say, but I, or but God. And the answer you choose will determine the life that you lead and the ministry that you offer. When I was first going through Fuller Seminary as a student, first church that I worked at was a church called La Crescenta First Baptist Church, and I got to preach there. And very early on when I was preaching, I was 5 or 10 minutes into the sermon and it wasn't going well and I didn't feel great. And the next thing I knew, I was laying on the floor. I had fainted dead away in the middle of my own sermon. It's a bad thing if other people fall asleep when you're preaching, but if you fall asleep when you're preaching, that's really not good. And there was a lot going on in my life. Nancy and I were just about to get married. I was headed for finals. We were going to be overseas for a year. A lot of stressors. So I thought, well, it's because of my situation. And we were overseas for a year, came back. I went back to school, back to work at the church. The very next time I got up to preach, I fainted dead away again. It's a true story. And the worst part of it is, it was a Baptist church, not a charismatic church where you get credit for doing that kind of a thing. And my boss, John F. Anderson, said to me, you're going to get up and preach it again next week. And I said, but I might faint again. Fainting when you talk is a bad quality in a preacher. It makes people nervous when you're talking. Then I'll tell you the truth. The passage about that thorn in the flesh, I lived that. I went to see a psychologist, Arch Hart. Dan, we were just talking about Arch, and he was the master of stress. And I wanted there to be some magic problem that would not make me embarrassed and some magic solution. And I had been trying to explore vocation enough at that point to know that I really wanted to preach. There's just something inside me sometimes that has this sense of God's presence or power or coming alive in those moments. But then I would faint. And I asked God, take the thorn of my fear away, and he did not. For a long chunk of time after that, I would literally just bring a chair up on the platform with me. And if I started to feel bad, I would sit down in the chair. And then people would say, help him, Jesus. So I heard that too. John, get up and preach. But I'm afraid, but I feel weak, but I think it's going to happen again. God did not take the weakness away. God did not take the fear away. God did not give me a guarantee. But God has, of this week, kept me upright while preaching for 40 years in a row. Some people are naturally confident when it comes to dating and asking people out and taking romantic risks. I was not. I was in my mid-20s at Fuller Seminary, never had a girlfriend. And I had dated Nancy 3 times, then she moved 2,000 miles away for graduate school, and I found out she was seeing a guy back there 2,000 miles away. My roommate said, you gotta call her. But I don't know what I'd say. But I don't know what she'd say. My roommate says, you gotta call her. So I called her, did not go well. At one point I said, what I'm trying to say is, I like you. And I was waiting for her to say, I like you too. Nothing, just nothing. And I thought, of course, that other guy is closer to her. He's better at this stuff than I am. He's better looking than I am, all of which is true. But I have no chance. But God smote that man down, romantically speaking. And we have now been married 40 years this June. Somebody on staff at HIM, who shall remain nameless, said to me just before getting up here today, John, the reason we invited you was to get Nancy here. Duh. Tell you something else. Dan mentioned he and I both used to work at the same church, different times. That's a but God story. That church began in 1873 with 13 members. I don't know how your church is doing. That church, over the next 50 years, grew from 13 members down to 12 members. That does not put you on magazine covers. Doesn't get you an outreach magazine. You know, going from 13 to 12 in 50 years. Almost closed down numerous times. One time, a couple came to the church with their own story. They had struggled with infertility. True story. Struggled with infertility. They'd been childless for 18 years, and then they had a little boy. And the husband got down on his knees to thank God for the child he believed to be a miracle. And they came to Menlo Church in one of those eras when the church was struggling. They actually bought the first organ and a red carpet for the church. And while they attended that church, their little boy died. And they grieved there and they prayed there. Didn't understand why. But God, out of that grief, gave them a dream to help other children. And they decided to start a school. The husband said, all of the children of California will be our children. And they started it right down the street from Menlo Park Presbyterian Church, and they named it after their dead son, Leland Stanford Jr. University. It's a strange thing. Before Stanford came to be, they were part of this little church and would sing songs like Great is Thy Faithfulness to that little organ. And they thought when their boy died, their life was over. But God had concerns for them and for education so that out of a deep grief would be born a great university and an explosion of innovation that would stun the world. A lot of people think that Silicon Valley, as we know it, never would have happened without Stanford. Nobody could predict that. No human intelligence could have foreseen that. And the church grew a lot bigger, has had glorious moments, very challenging moments. Strange thing that maybe its most important contribution to the world came when 12 people were sitting there. But God, therefore, do not resist this moment. Do not disregard the day of small things. Do not run away. Embrace this moment. Double down on the cross. This is not the first time Jesus' movement has seen an attendance dip. In John chapter 6, verse 66, interestingly enough, it says Jesus was teaching hard things. From that time on, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. Aren't you glad Jesus didn't pack it in and go back to carpentry work at that point? You know, 100 years ago, there was this thing called the Spanish flu. It was way deadlier. Estimates are 50 million people, maybe 100 million people around the world died because of it. You look this up. I had a great aunt that was a nurse during the Spanish influenza era back in 1918, 19, and 20. There are headlines from newspapers, Churchless Sunday coming. One of the headlines in the Los Angeles Times was, to mask or to unmask. That was during the Spanish flu. But church kind of kept on going after it was done. Now, we're living in a different day. It used to be people felt guilty if they did not go to church. When I was a kid, not only did we have to go to church Sunday morning, we even had churches Sunday night. Anybody remember Sunday night church? And it was like Sunday morning, only worse. They would have people preach on Sunday night. They wouldn't let preach on Sunday morning. And people sing. They wouldn't let sing on Sunday morning. You all know the numbers. Gallup says church membership is down from 70% in the year 2000 to 47% in the last 20 years. Barna says that 38% of pastors are seriously considering resigning. Churches used to be kind of like Field of Dreams. If you've ever seen that movie, if we build it, they will come. Maybe if they're not coming to us, we should be going to them. There's a church called Crossings in Oklahoma City. They have an interesting growth strategy. They now have ministry in every prison in the state of Oklahoma. One prison had room for a chapel, but of course, the state had no money for it. So the church said, we will raise the money and build the chapel and give it to the state. And I'll tell you a little secret. On a percentage basis, the most generous givers that church has are the inmates that attend the prison services. Our culture says, violent crime is up, there's bad people out there, lock them up and throw away the key. But God says, I was in prison, and you visited me. But God built his church on Peter and John, who went to jail, John the Baptist and Jesus, who were arrested and executed by the state, Paul and Silas, who did a midnight jail hymn sing. God used the penal system to bring Paul to Rome and plant the gospel of Jesus in the center of the known world. Nobody whiteboarded that, but God. So if we can't go back to yesterday, we can't. And we don't know what's coming tomorrow, nobody does. Then the question to ask is, what can I do today? How can God use me today? This has been a real painful season for me and for my family. It's part of why it's real meaningful to be with you. It has involved a lot of loss and a lot of introspection and a lot of question. I've needed to let go of a lot of stuff I never planned on letting go of. And I still have a lot to learn. But I have found God in the darkness in ways I never knew him in sunnier days. But I have found that when fixing a problem is beyond me, meaning is still available. It's a funny thing. I have found I can meet together with people on a field of pain that I could never meet with on a field of triumph. But God. On the final night of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life, he gave a message. Some of you will have read it. He talks about going to the mountaintop. Talks about the danger that his life faced. Didn't know he was going to die that night. And he says in that talk, if God had allowed him to live any time in history, And he just thinks through what could it have been like to be alive in Egypt in the days of the Pharaoh, or Greece with Plato and Aristotle, or the days of Jesus. He says, if I could have chosen any moment, I would have said to my Creator, I want to be alive for a few days in the latter half of the 20th century. He says, I know that sounds strange because the world is all messed up. The nation is sick. Trouble is at the land. But God is at work, and here it is. Martin Luther King said, I know somehow only when it is dark enough can you see the stars. That's why it's a great day to be ministers. It's getting a little darker. And Paul says, God's plan is for you to shine like the stars. But God is not done. But God is not willing that any should perish. But God chose the lowly. But God chose the weak. But God chose the nobodies. And we know this because of the one but God that lies at the center of history and the center of Scripture. Paul says in the very first sermon ever preached on the day of Pentecost, Acts chapter 2, this Jesus of Nazareth was handed over to you, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to a cross. But God raised him from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death, because it was impossible for death. It was impossible for death to keep its hold on him. I love in Matthew's account, when the women have heard from the angel, and left the empty tomb, we're told they're terrified but filled with joy. What a great way to live. Suddenly they see Jesus, and he says a single word to them, greetings. That always seems so understated to me. He has just conquered death, left the tomb, defeated the grave, and all he has to say is, greetings. Then he walks away. Dale Bruner's fabulous commentary on Matthew writes of a children's sermon asking the children, does anyone know what Jesus said after the resurrection? And one little girl raised her hand and said, I do. Ta-da! Which is not a bad translation. Like, what'd you expect? Like death can't keep its hold on you either. Why would God not want this? Why would we not give ourselves wholly to be a part of it? You know, sometimes I'll watch stories like that of IJM or of Compassion, and Nancy and I have both been parts of those ministries, traveled with them, give to them, love them. It can be tempting to think those are so dramatic compared to what I do. But you know what? The parachurch will not survive if the local church dies. What you do matters. When you pray, when you serve, when you teach, when you challenge, when you give, when your heart gets broken and your great dream dies, and you ask God to redeem the suffering, and you trust God to give you a new dream to lead you through a dark day, you become part of this unseen spiritual hinge on which the doors of history turn. But God, but God, but God, but God. So when you leave this conference, in person or online, you take these two words with you. Don't you give up. Whatever hurt or heartbreak you're facing, when you feel inadequate, when you feel unspiritual, when you feel lonely, when you know you're not smart enough or strong enough or rich enough or good enough or wise enough or gifted enough, when you feel like a loser, like a nobody, like a failure, go preach the word and feed the poor and visit the prison and love the lonely and remember the forgotten and bless your enemies and tell the good news. But God. God bless you.
Hey, I hope you like that podcast, and if you want this ministry to keep on with all these wonderful speakers, would you consider please giving to Hawaiian Islands Ministries? And you can do that by just hitting the give button on our website, himonline.org, and hitting follow or subscribe in whatever streaming service you're using. That would be awesome. Also, know that in March 13 to 15, the HIM 2025 conference is coming. HDND, Hope Does Not Disappoint, with Beth Moore and many other speakers. Please consider joining us. It's wonderful to have this great time worshiping together, and we're going to have great worship and hundreds of churches represented. So hope to see you at HIM 2025, March 13 to 15. See you later.